Ready for a deep dive into the totally hilarious and surprisingly insightful world of men and women?
Always up for a good laugh. And maybe a little self-reflection along the way, right?
Exactly. We're diving into excerpts you provided from Oh, well, you know how women are, and isn't that just like a man? By Irvin S. Cobb and Mary Roberts Rinehart.
Oh, those titles alone, I can already tell these authors don't hold back.
Not even a little, but that's what makes it so fun, right? It's like taking a peek into the past almost a century ago to see what they had to say about the battle of the sexes.
And seeing if any of it still rings true today, I bet.
Exactly. So let's start with Irvin Cobb. He has this hilarious bit about a woman on a simple shopping trip.
Oh, I think I remember this one. It's the one where it takes her like 10 minutes to find anything in her purse, right?
That's the one. He makes this whole production out of it, like finding the bus fare is an epic quest through a bottomless handbag.
Classic. And then there's that image of a woman trying to navigate a crowded streetcar in a tight skirt, and heels takes her twice as long as anyone else.
It's such a classic image, right? But it makes you wonder, was he just poking fun at women, or was he making a larger point? Like, he also talks about women clinging to streetcar straps like clinging vines. It's funny, but it also feels kind of pointed, you know?
Yeah, like he's hinting at how women were perceived back then as delicate and needing assistance, which, when you think about it, connects to another point he makes about women's clothing.
You mean like how he goes on and on about men's pockets?
Exactly. He contrasts the abundance of pockets in men's clothing with the distinct lack of them in women's clothes.
Which is so true. It's such a small detail, but it speaks volumes about societal expectations. Like, men were expected to carry practical items, be prepared for anything, right?
And women, not so much. It's almost like their clothing was designed for style over function.
Totally. It makes you think about how much those expectations have really changed, doesn't it?
It really does. And speaking of societal expectations, Cobb also wades into the waters of women in the workplace.
Oh, yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. He seems to acknowledge that women are perfectly competent.
Right. But then you sense this hesitation, this underlying question, like, could women really handle true equality in the workplace, even when it comes to things like clothing?
Right. Like, he couldn't quite picture a world where women dressed for practicality on the job. This was the 1920s, after all, a time of huge societal shifts.
And anxieties about those shifts. Cobb's humor, even if unintentional, seems to reflect some of those anxieties surrounding women's changing roles. It's fascinating to think about.
It really is. It makes you wonder how much of that still lingers today, even if it's subconscious, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you think. But for now, let's switch gears over to Mary Roberts Rinehart and her take on all of this.
Oh, I love her. She's got such a sharp wit.
The best. And she dives right into the male psyche in her book, pokes a little fun at men and their need for, like, social conventions.
You mean like that story she tells about the guy at the luncheon? The one who tucks his napkin into his watch pocket?
Yes. And he is totally mortified. It's priceless. But she makes the point that most women would have just laughed it off, you know, like, no big deal.
Totally. It's like men are held to these stricter standards of behavior even if they don't realize it.
Right. Like, they're more likely to be embarrassed if they accidentally break some social norm. And Reinhardt, she takes it even further, claiming that men never really outgrow their boyishness.
Oh, yeah. Even when they're older, more responsibilities. It's like that Peter Pan syndrome she talks about.
Exactly. And she has all these examples, like a man planning a golf game. He'll want 3 other guys to join him, but a woman in the same situation, she might just invite 1 or 2 friends.
It's such a small detail, but it makes you think. Like maybe men, they just find it easier to connect through those shared activities, you know?
And that maybe they don't necessarily need the same level of deep emotional connection in their friendships as women do.
Right. Like women often build their bonds on those really intense shared experiences, emotional intimacy. It's not that one way is better or worse, but just different. What do you think? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, that definitely resonates. And Reinhardt, she doesn't shy away from those differences between men and women, especially when it comes to relationships, right?
Oh, absolutely not. She really goes there, like that line about how normal women need men all the time, but normal men, they only need women some of the time. Bold move, Reinhardt.
I know, but it's so funny, like that bit about how a man could be on the golf course, so engrossed in the game, that you could shout his wife's name through a megaphone and he wouldn't even notice.
Or the stock market. Don't forget about the stock market.
Right. Like, those are the two things that'll totally capture a man's attention, according to Rinehart.
Totally. Maybe a little exaggerated, but still funny.
Totally. It makes you think, though, how much of that exaggeration comes from those fundamental differences she's talking about, you know? Like men being more activity-oriented, maybe less emotionally present sometimes.
It's a really interesting question. And it ties into what she says later about communication or the lack thereof between men and women.
Oh, yeah, like when she talks about wives trying to share stories about their work lives, and their husbands just stare at them blankly.
It's like all those hours of listening to their husband's work stories just went in one ear and out the other. It's so true.
The worst. So what does she say is at the root of all that?
Well, she has this theory that men just aren't wired for hypocrisy. You know, like they either care about something or they don't. Simple as that.
And women.
Women, she argues, are kind of forced into it, right?
Mhm.
Because they're often the ones stuck smoothing things over in social situations. So they get really good at, like, feigning interest when they need to.
So it's not that women are being intentionally dishonest. It's more like they've developed this social survival skill.
Exactly. And she connects this back to her earlier points about men in convention. Like, men, they may be individually honest in their personal lives, but then, she argues, that honesty can backfire in a bigger picture kind of way.
How so?
Well, she calls it political lethargy, basically. Men not engaging in politics because they see it as corrupt. But she argues that this refusal to get involved, even if it comes from a place of personal honesty, can actually lead to more corruption in the long run.
Wow. That is a really interesting point. So it's like she's saying that sometimes even our best intentions can have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And that those consequences might play out differently for men and women given their different social conditioning. Makes you think, huh.
It really does. Cobb and Rinehart, they definitely gave us a lot to think about, didn't they? And you listening in, did any of those observations resonate with you? It's amazing how some things never really change. Even almost a century later, those dynamics between men and women, they're still relevant, still something we're trying to navigate. And sometimes a little humor is the best way to shed light on those age-old differences, wouldn't you say?